Good morning. Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is exciting. I'm happy to be back. Hopefully, some of you are returning people that came to the first webinar, those joining us for the second webinar. And if not, if you're new to this whole webinar series, this is the second in a TGE one. I'll get into the little details. If you missed the first one, you're still going to benefit from this one. But I just want to say welcome to Writing Great Unit Tests with ChefSpec. My name is Franklin Weber. So I've got a long history working in technology. It actually started when I was in the U.S. military, and then I left the military and then started down the long, treacherous path of tech support, quality assurance, automation, and everything like that. Occasionally, I drink coffee. This is one of those moments. I just discovered it. It's this wonderful brown liquid. You consume it, and you get energy. I encourage you, if you haven't tried it, try it. I think it's going to catch on. All right. So there's a little more about me I could, of course, go into, but if you are familiar, I've done a lot of Ruby programming, I've done presenting, and I'm a trainer here at Chef. So I've been doing training for a little while now, and I'm beginning to really enjoy it. So I'm glad all of you are here because, of course, a trainer without people to learn is really, I'm just talking to myself. So I'm happy to have you here. So let me talk to you a little bit about who I think you are. So I think you're probably a chef cookbook author. So that means that you are someone at your company that develops cookbooks for a living. You may be someone that's in a non-technical space, but I assume you're in the technical space. I, of course, assume you're smart, intelligent, funny. You've got some experience working with chefs, in this case, like I said, building cookbooks and things like that. And I believe you've got some experience with testing because you wouldn't immediately just click on unit testing, right? That wouldn't make a lot of sense to you unless you knew something about testing. And for some of you, you may even be quite a bit, on the dark side of testing, on that advanced side over there, on the, that side over there. Oh, no, wait, I'm reversed here. There we go. This side over here, the Darth Vader of testing. That might be you. You are probably a trendsetter within your organization, and so hopefully this material, while maybe not beneficial exactly for you, you will probably or hopefully find that's beneficial for someone else within your organization. Oh, if you notice here, I'm in Wisconsin. It's snowing, so I thought I'd put myself in a little snow bubble so you can see a little bit or experience a little bit about what's going on here. So let's keep moving. So here's some housekeeping items before we get started. So we're doing a little bit of that, the introduction, some demonstration, lives, blah, blah, our schedule and stuff like that. Later, we're going to be doing the slides and live demonstration, and by later, I mean in about a minute. And then at about 45 minutes after the hour, we're going to go into questions and any comments and things like that. And then with about 5 minutes or so left, we'll leave some time to do some further resources, point you in the right direction, where you can go to find more information. And then as well, just a little wrap up and things like that. So let me give you a little bit, part of the housekeeping thing is, this course and this content that I'm going to go through, I'm going to go pretty quickly through it. And I'm going to leave out a little bit, and I'm going to put in a lot in certain areas. If you have any questions as I go through it, please use the interface to ask the question. So the BrightTalk interface allows you to ask a question. Now, if you want to just leave a comment about the speed at which I speak or any of the content in which you would like to see or things you'd like to see in the future, please give us a rating and then give us some feedback. Give us a comment. If this series is working for you, if you'd like to see more things from us, this presentation itself was brought to you by essentially the people that came to the first webinar and expressed interest in seeing some more. So I put it together, and I'd love to put together more things if more people are interested. So please let me know. And of course, I encourage you to share it. So there's a lot of great content in here, a lot of great information. Ooh, my snow is kind of getting bad here. Let me turn it off. Here we go. There. Whew, it's getting a little too snowy for me. I encourage you to share it with your professional organizations. And that way, what you could do is that, they can benefit from it. They can watch this, and they can learn from it. And you can have some great conversations during lunch or other times, before you do a code review, et cetera, because there's a lot of good things, a lot of benefits, essentially, for your whole team sort of adopting these practices. Okay, so without further ado, my name is Franklin Weber, and this is Writing Great Unit Tests with ChefSpec. Okay, so this is the agenda that we have for today. It's quite a bit, so we've got about 40 minutes to go through quite a bit of content, and I want to just move through it quickly. So like I said, I'm going to go through this pretty quick, and the hope is that you'll watch this again if you're confused about some content. And of course, you'll raise questions if you have any, and I can reach out to you. I'll be providing resources to you at the end, so if at any point there's something that doesn't make sense, I'll give you links to the documentation. I'll give you links to the slides here. I'll give you links to this content, and like I said, you can always watch the video again. So we're going to review the cookbook that we left on last time with the presentation. So we're going to go through all of that content. So I'm going to do it live. I love to do live content and live presentations, and the reason for it is because I want to make sure you see everything and sort of get a feel for it, where slides aren't going to give you that experience. So here, I'm going to open up my editor of choice of this week and start with a little bit about what this project is. And this is a project called HTTPD. So this is an Apache project that is setting up an Apache web server. Now, the first place I would actually look while going into this project is probably the README. Oh, sad trombone. Womp womp, right? So apparently I don't have any information about what this project is about. And so one thing I can do, of course, is go to the command line if I don't know much about the project, and I can ask some questions about it using Git. So I'm going to do a git log command to see some comments that I may have written to myself to understand a little bit more about the project. Oh, and there, oops, here I was just doodling a little bit. Here it says, here's the initial commit. Sorry, future me, I didn't write a README, but at least I wrote a git commit message. All right, so past me, that's fine. You know what? You get half credit for at least writing a comment that seems at least aware of the failures that you made. So I can't be too mad at past me. But future me, current me, is really sad because, of course, I don't have a README to describe it. Well, the next place to really look for things, if you don't have a README, you don't have a good commit message, I would say is start with the kitchen configuration file. The kitchen configuration file is going to tell you a little bit about whether you've got testing set up. And so this is what's really nice is that I could start reading the code, but really what's important is, do I have a way to verify the expectations? Do I have any expectations on what the code does? And if I look at the kitchen configuration file that I'm staring at, right here, I'm reversed. Right here, you'll see that there's some important information, and probably the two most important pieces of information are right here. The platforms and then the suite. So we'll see that I'm testing this cookbook with this recipe. So that's the default recipe that we're testing against, so I know which recipe to actually look at. And this is the test suite, and that's the platform, and so we know where to get started. So with that test suite name, this suite name right here, I know that I could go here to test integration default and look underneath the server spec directory and look at default spec. So I'm going to look at that, default spec.rb. So, oh, that's the wrong one. There's so many default specs. Let's go to this one, test integration default spec. Okay, so this is the initial test that we have, which is saying, hey, I want to make sure that the website is up and running. So this is the integration test that we wrote last time. And it was great because it was essentially giving us proof that our system is working, that our website is set up and it's telling us welcome home. So we know that from the kitchen configuration file that we're applying the default recipe. So I'm going to open up the default recipe. And if I look at the default recipe, I see that there's the include recipe here. So this recipe includes another recipe, takes care of some configuration, and then takes care of the service. And I assume this recipe that includes is the install recipe, which probably takes care of, yep, taking care of the package and stuff like that. So that's great. So that's wonderful that this is essentially here. And so everything's working. Now, if I were to, and what it looks like is that somebody didn't finish, and I say previous Frank, didn't finish the work that essentially I was going to do, which was perhaps convert the remainder of this code into its own sort of sub-recipes. And we could go into that content here, but I want to just see the test suite work. So I've got the test suite running here on my local machine. So I'll run kitchen converge, which will converge the system. And then I'm going to run kitchen verify, which is going to run that test. So the first one is going to take care of essentially applying the recipe, installing Chef, applying the recipe to my test instance. And then the verify is going to take care of, right here, now we're in the verify step. It's going to take care of all the validation. And I see that everything is working. Now, you'll notice it doesn't take very long for me to do this. It takes about 3 seconds. But we identified an issue this last time, which was, hey, if I comment a piece of code out, if I mutate my code slightly to see if problems exist, right? Does my test suite actually cover the content that I wanted to cover? And will it catch the issues that I wanted to catch, right? Here I've created a typo by essentially commenting out this include recipe line. I'll notice that the test suite still passes. And the reason for that is because we're using Kitchen Convergence Verify, which keeps an instance up and running. And instead, what we need to be using is Kitchen Test. Now, I'm going to switch over to another tab. So I have two tabs here. So tab 1 was where we're running commands initially. Tab 2 was a command that I ran earlier before this all started. Now, when I run Kitchen Test, it takes 3 minutes and 47 seconds to do the work of verifying that one little line of code. And if I were to run Kitchen Test right now, I would see a failure. But it would take 3 minutes and 47 seconds to get a failure. And you know what that means? It's time to drink coffee, right? Like if I was going to have to wait 3 minutes and 47 seconds. But I mean, I could drink coffee, right? And I could drink coffee and take a break at this moment. But imagine I had to take this break all the time. Like every time I made a little change, I had to wait 4 minutes. That is a lot of coffee. Like I'm enjoying coffee. I'm really getting into it. But I don't know if I can drink that much coffee. And so this is where I think we have a problem, is then the feedback cycle that we've created isn't giving us feedback fast enough. And so that's what I want to take a look at. So we looked at the HTTPD cookbook. These slides are going to repeat a lot of what I showed you here, just to kind of duplicate what I said, because I'm communicating at a very fast pace, because like I said, we have a lot of content to get through. So here's a README file. Unfortunately, there was nothing in it. I look at the git log and I see, of course, my stat excuse for commit message. And then I move into the kitchen YAML file. I see my platforms, my suites. So I know I have a test suite set up. I see the actual test that's available. So again, the website is up and available. And then I see the recipe that's going on. So that's great. And I see the install recipe that's taking care of it. So that's the existing cookbook. So we have this slower feedback cycle. So you're caught up. If you want to watch the previous presentation, you may. But right now, you're caught up to everything we saw before in the previous presentation. So here we are. We have a slow feedback cycle. And the reason for this slow feedback cycle is because we have a lot of external dependencies. Now, Test Kitchen does a good job of isolating us from a lot of external things, right? We are or could be talking to EC2, but we're not. I'm actually using VirtualBox and Vagrant on my local machine. So here we go. This is the test instance running inside of VirtualBox. So I've launched VirtualBox and I can see it. Test Kitchen is now using that and controlling that. I never have to deal with the VirtualBox interface. So that's really nice. But there's still external dependencies, right? Test Kitchen is really testing against a real instance right here, right? It's creating it's creating a CentOS image. It's installing Chef on that image. The executing test, that doesn't take so long. It's really these two steps right here that take the longest amount of time. And probably this is going to take longer and longer the more complicated the recipe we go. So this is something that's a problem for us. Now, the thing is, when we read our recipes, or when Chef reads these recipes, what it does is it builds a resource collection. You might think of the resource collection as really like a to-do list. So when Chef reads all the recipes and reads the resources, it makes a big list of all the things that it's going to do. It doesn't execute it right away, but it kind of like puts a box here. I'd like to think of it as sort of like a shopping list. So really it's writing down like, hey, butter, milk, eggs, those kind of basics that you might be getting in your home. And essentially after it has a list, it then now goes through and says, okay, execute, execute, execute. So there's two phases in this resource collection thing. Now, the nice part about that thought is like, if we have a resource collection, then we know that we could probably make some assertions about the contents of that the resource collection. And that's something that actually ChefSpec does. So ChefSpec takes it further, takes the testing further by isolating everything just down to the resource collection. A little bit more and a little bit around that, but really that's the gist of it. It's going to allow us to essentially express expectations about what's inside that resource collection, what's taking place inside of our recipes, isolated from every other environment and other things like that. Now, it's important to know that ChefSpec is built on top of RSpec, similar to ServerSpec, similar to InSpec. So you're going to be using Ruby code to essentially express these expectations. Any time spent learning ServerSpec, InSpec is going to make you a better ChefSpec developer. And so the more time you spend learning these things, like I said, the better you're going to be. So let's look a little bit further inside of ChefSpec. So again, ChefSpec is really doing this. It's building the node, it's building a resource collection, and then executing tests against it. Whereas Test Kitchen is really taking a lot of time, which is creating the instance, installing Chef, and applying the run list. So that's why this is going to take somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 seconds. And this is going to take 3 minutes and 45 seconds, at least on my machine. You know, mileage may vary, type of thing. All right. So let's do that. Let's actually run our existing test suite. Let's use our unit test to give us the feedback that we want. So I'm going to look at the existing test suite that automatically gets generated with the cookbook that I have here. So I'm going to look at that default spec that I have present. So here is the default spec that I got present in the system, and it tells me, you remember I had a confusion between which default spec? This is the one in the spec unit recipes directory. So here it says spec unit recipes directory. This is where all the ChefSpec files go. This is where all the ChefSpec unit tests go. And I'm going to break down a little bit of this slide here, but that's where the test is. So here's the test that's defined at the moment. Let's just run this. And the way that you run these tests is by running chef exec RSpec. And you can specify the path to this file. So spec/unit recipes default spec. And I'm going to make this a little bit larger so we can see that and we can run that. Hey, what's going to happen? I think, like I said, 9 seconds. Don't make me a liar, ChefSpec. All right, 9, okay, I'm a little bit of a liar. So I lied a little bit, 9.21 seconds to load and run. And my little head is blocking what's the most important information. It says 1 example, 0 failure. So let's take a look at that content to see what's going on with it. So I'm going to switch back to the slides here. So that's the existing spec file. Now you'll notice here I have some other spec files. That's if I had gone through the content, if I had refactored those remaining recipes into their sub-recipes like I talked about in the first one. So here's the spec file that exists with the content. So let's break this thing down. So what you see when you initially see the spec file is Ruby. So this is a Ruby language. It looks very similar to server spec in spec, but it's got its own sort of unique things about it. And particularly what's got some unique things about it is that we express the cookbook name, recipe name up above here. So that is very purposely HTTPD default, right? So that right there is very important that's there. And then these are all example groups. So if you remember before, describes, do, end. So this do is tied to this end. This context do is another example group that's tied to this end. What it does is allow us to encapsulate these ideas or these sort of scenarios further down so we can further refine it. And the scenario that we're defining is when I apply the HTTPD's default recipe, when all attributes are default on an unspecified platform, it should converge successfully. So let's move down to that example right here. So this is an example. The example is essentially allowing us to express our expectation. And the expectation here that we're expressing is that the chef run should not cause an error. We're not saying it should work or that it does the right thing. All we're saying is it shouldn't get us into trouble. And so in this case, the expectation here is that it should not raise an error, which is pretty good. Now there's missing some underscores, I think, hidden, but there's underscores there, and there's underscore there, and underscore there. So I've kind of blocked those out with that blue bar, but you'll see it in the source code. So that's us expressing the expectation. Now, what is this other code that's in here that I didn't really talk about? Well, you'll see this little block right here, this let block. This let block is setting up a helper, and that helper allows us to define that in-memory runner that essentially builds that resource collection. There are 2 runners you can choose from, server runner or a solo runner, like a chef solo experience. By default, the server runner is the one that's chosen. And this server runner is a Ruby class. It's just setting up a fake in-memory instance of essentially the server. And it's going to converge it. So you see here, it says, I'm going to build the runner here. So it's building the runner. And then I'm going to converge it here with the described recipe. And described recipe is really the value you specified here. That's just a shortcut that allows us not to repeat HTTPD : default everywhere within our, essentially our spec file. So that's the breakdown of this file. And there's a lot to ChefSpec. We're going to play with it a little bit over the time here, but I'll show you some great documentation to give you more examples. So when I ran this, you'll see that this is an example output. The output is by default in this progress format. Progress format means show period, stars, Fs for failures. You know, I'll show you a little bit more about this, but we saw that one passing example. So what we need to do is identify the test that we want to write. And so the test that we want to write is actually present inside of the default recipe. So if I look inside the default recipe, the test that I want to define is this one right here. I want to make sure that the default recipe includes the HTTPD install recipe. So I'm going to go back down here, and inside of this block, inside of this context, right, I'm going to define a new example. And that example is when all attributes are default on an unspecified platform, it includes the install recipe. And I'm just going to write it like this. I'm going to write it without a do and end. You notice there's no do and end. I'm not going to write those because what I want to do is write this out. Think about all the recipes that I might want to write. You know, I could also come through and say, it includes the configuration recipe, right? I could write all of the examples out that I want to do or that I want to express without worrying about the syntax of it. What I really love about this is it allows me to kind of define the work that I want. It allows me to express my thoughts in English before I have to go figure out how to write this in the testing language. Because at first when you start writing tests, you're going to have a hard time figuring out the test to write and then the actual content of those tests. And so the last one might be like the service recipe. So I'm only interested in our time here, this first one right here. So I'm going to comment those out. And now I'm going to return to the command line and I'm going to run the same command again, chefexec RSpec. And this time I'm going to use a flag called -C to show color because I want to show you this in a color output. So time to sip some coffee. We got 9 seconds. See, 9 seconds you can sip a little coffee. There we go. All right, so you see from the output what we've got is one example that's passing and then one example that's pending. So because I implemented the test in the way that I did, the example the way that I did without a body, it automatically marks it as a pending test. And I think that's great because now it leaves me all the work, you know, essentially allows me to express it, leaves me the pending test. And now when I can figure it out, when I understand it, I can go look up the documentation, right, and think about it, or now write it out. So let's go to the documentation for ChefSpec. So I'm going to go to GitHub. I'm going to go to the ChefSpec project. The ChefSpec project is great for documentation. So if you look here on the README for the project, there's a lot of great examples. And you can usually just do a Command F or Control F to find on the page for something you want. If you can't find something on the page that you want, you can always go to the examples folder at the top. The examples folder at the top will have all the examples of a bunch of tests being used. In our case, we want to look at include recipe being used. So I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to come down here to the recipes to kind of see an example here. And it says, oh, there's a recipe, include recipe other. That's exactly what I want to do. That's exactly the code that I've, you know, or almost the code that I've written. And I'm going to go to the spec file now and then see how it's written. And I see, okay, so they're using a solo runner, not a server runner, but I can see the expectation being expressed here. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to minimize our documentation here. I'm going to return back to expectation, and I'm going to return here and express that. Now, I'm going to say I expect the chef run to include the recipe. What I want to say is the cookbook name and then the recipe name. So I'm going to do install. And then I'm going to save the file and then return to the prompt and then run this again. Now, what I'm hoping to see is a failure because remember, my default recipe doesn't have the content in it yet, right? It doesn't have anything essentially uncommented. The install recipe is not yet included. Now, instead of waiting 3 minutes and 45 seconds to get feedback, I've now waited 9 or 10 seconds to get feedback. So very quickly, I'm able to determine that the install recipe is not giving me the content, essentially not being loaded like I hope it would be. So I'm going to return to the recipe. I have my failure. I am now not quite doing test-driven development, but it's my sort of secret way of doing test-driven development. I ensure that the tests work in this way. So now I'm going to uncomment the test, and I'm going to run this command again, and I should see this pass. And what's great is I have proof that the test that I just wrote works, right? And so if I were to continue on through the remainder of these exercises, all right, great job. So sip of coffee for that. Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to be juiced up if I keep doing successful work like this. So if I was to do the remainder of this content here, right, if I was to replace the remainder of these little things, I would probably do the same thing. You know, do the include recipe, comment it out, make sure the test fails, and then continue on. So that's something, an exercise that you're welcome to do if you want to play with this exercise. So let's just do a quick review. So here's what we have right now, that include recipe. So we're going to review all the content we went through. We say, hey, let's write the pending test in, right? Allow us to express ourselves in English or whatever your native language happens to be. And then that allows us to go eventually to see the pending test, see the work that we have to do, see a little bit about it. I didn't really go into this, but of course what's really nice is in the RSpec output, you're going to get the line number in the spec file of the failure along with the summary, or in this case, the pending. We see the output here, always going to tell us whether things are impending and things like that. And now I went through and already wrote and execute the test. So let's write and execute the test to see the failure. I searched the chef documentation for it. I use the examples directory. This is the code that I came up with. This is probably what you would come up with if you wrote it as well. And then I saw a failure. The failure example here was great. And now I am the mender of my infrastructure fixing the code to execute the test. So here I uncomment this include. Again, this is as I refactor the remainder. So that's why you see those other includes along the way here. And then I see 2 passing tests. So 2 examples, 0 failures, and there it goes. It's great. So you notice here the yak is feeling like it needs to be shaved. So let's talk a little bit about testing some other resources. So I want to do one more quick example of testing the resources inside the install recipe. So that's one example of testing inclusion of recipes. What I want to show you now is testing an actual resource, because that's an important step. So we're going to go through the same series of steps as we did before. I'm going to look in the install recipe. I'm going to see now that the thing that I want to test is this package line right here. So I'm going to go to the install spec. The nice part about using Chef Generate tools is that it's automatically going to generate you this unit test right here. And you'll notice that I already have this test set up. I set this up to sort of give myself a little more time to show you some debugging later, which is going to be very cool. And you'll see I expect the chef run to install the package HT2PD. So what I'm saying here is that it installs the necessary package, and I expect the chef run to install this package. And I'll break this down a little bit more, but this is really how you express your expectations inside of these examples. So let's return to the command line, I think actually, and just run this. So I'm going to change this to default, from default to install. I'm going to use color because I love to see the color here. And in about 9 seconds or so, I will see the result of this. And what I should see is two tests and 2 things pass. Now the thing is, I don't know if this test works right away, right? Because this code already existed, I'm nervous that in this case that the test doesn't work. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll just comment things out, I'll run the test again, and then I'll see a failure, or I hope to see a failure. Because if I don't see a failure, the tests that I'm writing are not testing the code that I've defined. And there we go. I see the failure, so I feel pretty confident about this. So there we go. I've got my test in place, and I feel pretty confident about testing resources. So let's just kind of review that. And really testing resources is just, again, following the documentation, looking at the examples, and doing something very similar that we did before. So in this case, we have the install recipe. If I had not previously written the test, I would see 1 example, 1 failure, or excuse me, 0 failures. I would run it installs the necessary package. I'd run this as a pending test, and then I would go to the documentation to figure out the example. Now here I'm putting a link to essentially the example package. Again, there's some great examples in the documentation or in that examples folder. And here's the output that I expressed. Now let's break this part down because I think this is kind of interesting, and also there's confusion that comes on. So really any resource that you define, you are really specifying the resource's action here, underscore the resource, and then you're using the resource's name, whatever that value is. And then there's all this other stuff you can do with like with options. You could say with these parameters, with this mode, with this URL, with this whatever. So take a look at the documentation. There's ways you can express the very, down to the minutia, down to the detail you might need to, that you might want to capture. There's another thing to take a look at is this right here. You'll notice that this example has a curly brace and this one has a parenthesis. The only time you're ever going to use the curly brace is in this one right here. It converges successfully. And the reason for that, not to get too detailed, is that this is a block. And in this case, blocks, what we were trying to do is capture the chef run, put it inside of this sort of container, this block, in case it explodes. Because if there's an error, we want to make sure we capture it. And the block allows us to sort of put code in there and then capture the explosion so it doesn't blow up in our face. With the parentheses, it does things a little bit differently. It won't catch the error cleanly. It'll usually just make it'll just blow up in your face. And so that's an important difference here. What's nice is ChefSpec, when you run it, is going to tell you if you use it incorrectly. So if you feel like, which one do I use? Just use one or the other. And of course, what's going to happen is RSpec, essentially ChefSpec, is going to tell you which one it is. It's going to give you the right answer. So here we saw 2 examples, 0 failures, and of course, I said it was too quiet. And this is something I do all the time, right? Because I didn't build this in a test-driven way. If it's too quiet, it's time to mutate your test. So I'm a big fan of that test mutation that I introduced to you in the first webinar. So I come through, I comment things out, I then see the failure. And after I see the failure, I then uncomment it and see the success to make sure that my tests are covering the content I want. Yeah, I did miss you, little yak. All right, so let's actually go into some refactoring. So now that we have these tests in place, we have this fast feedback cycle, we can now have some time to do some quick refactoring of some of these things that we've defined. And what we want to do is refactor to attributes. And that's what I'm going to push for. So remember, the idea is that we want to make our recipes fairly modular. So in the event that, say, another cookbook needs to use our cookbook, it can. And it can get the most effect or get most use out of our cookbook without really having to reproduce or recreate things that it doesn't need to. So in this case, there might be a WordPress cookbook or any kind of cookbook that might need to use the Apache cookbook. And in this case, it might need to use the install on the service, but it says, hey, you know what? I want a custom homepage, or I don't even want the homepage that you provide, right? This is something that we can take a look at. Do we need to replace this homepage? Is it because this path is not right? Is it because this content is something we want to configure? These are things that we can actually specify and make configurable. And we're going to do that in this section. Really, we're going to look at the sort of package section and see that same recipe and see how we can make it configurable. Now, this is all done because what we want to do is essentially allow for the values that we specified, instead of being hard-coded to, HTTPD or var/something something. We want to make them attributes on the node. And we want to make them exposed on the node so that other cookbooks can replace them, or other environments or other roles can replace them. And these attributes by default are coming from OHI when OHI runs, but we can provide some in the cookbook. And so that's what we're going to look at here. So we're going to refactor things, in this case, to use a node attribute. And I'm going to use what the Yak is suggesting, dream-driven development. Dream-driven development is my way of essentially going to the code and saying, you know what? I just want to use a node attribute that I believe exists right here, right now. I believe we should have a node attribute called this, and it should be package name, right? So in this case, what we're telling it is package, I want you to install whatever value happens to be at this node attribute. Or, and right now, I don't think anything's set, but something could be set, and that's something that we should take into consideration. So I'm going to run the same, essentially, install recipe. I'm going to clear my screen, kind of give some space for this, and I'm going to run this, and I'm going to see an error. I'm actually going to see a lot of errors. But what I am going to see is that our tests are going to give us feedback pretty quickly that we have some problems. Now, here's an example of the two errors. So it tells us 2 failures happen. And the reason why we get 2 failures happen is because we essentially have a no method error. It says undefined method, square bracket for nil class. And the reason for that is because we've defined an attribute and we're essentially trying to access an attribute on top of an attribute that doesn't exist. So really what we're happening is we're trying to pull something out of nothing. And that's why we're getting, hey, there is nothing in here. Essentially, no class doesn't have the ability to pull content out of it. So our tests are actually working for us. They're giving us feedback, and they're telling us very quickly that in this case, the package name doesn't exist. So dream-driven development-wise, this is almost there. So now let's go through and let's actually create the attributes file. So I'm going to use the Chef Generate tool to generate this for me. So I believe it's attributes. And then I'm just going to call it default. And within my cookbook directory, it's going to generate and create for me a default.rv file inside of the attributes directory. So if I look inside of here, I'll see I've got an attributes directory. It's a nice colored green here because I've got some Git running with Atom. And I'll see that there is nothing defined in here. I'm going to set up this attribute. So I'm just going to go back to the install. I'm going to copy this. And the attributes file is actually kind of special. You don't specify node. What you do say is the precedence level at which you'd like to set that. That's a longer conversation, but generally what you want is set it to default. So we're saying the default value for this node attribute should be what? In this case, HTTPD. So this looks right. I hopefully have set this up correctly, and I'm going to run this through and run my test to see if it passes. And take a moment to drink some coffee. Coffee. All right, so that passes. Oh, wonderful. So let's go through a little review, a little bit about what that did. So what was nice is without, this is one of those reasons why I love unit testing, because unit testing allows me to get that feedback quick. Whereas if I were to wait 3 minutes and 45 seconds just to kind of test out this attributes thing, I don't think I could have done it as quick and easy. And we could actually extrapolate this further. When I go to multiple platforms, when I go to multiple platform versions, that kind of thing, this really, unit testing is going to give you a lot of insight and sort of figure that out. So that's what I wrote inside of the install recipe, dreamed it up, just wrote up what I thought should exist. I ran the test. The failure is going to make us stronger here because we know that things are going to work. We see chef exec RSpec. You can actually run the command without essentially the path to the file, and it's going to load and run all your tests in the spec directory. And then here we say, all right, so let's create the attributes file, and that's what I did. I generated the attributes file. I generated the attributes default file essentially inside of there, and then I can look at that content. So that's just a default. We just call it the default.rb file. We wrote in the default attribute, and then we execute the test to see everything pass. So here we go, chef exec RSpec. You know what, I should probably run that. There's a good time. It's like, hey, do all our tests pass? Because if one test passes, that's probably good, but really we should test our entire suite and make sure that everything is passing. Lovely. All right, so we got 4 examples, 0 failures. And here's a little tip. I didn't put this in the slides, but if you're tired of running like -C for color, you could type in RSpec-init, and it's going to create a .RSpec file and a spec helper file. Well, that actually exists, but it's going to create the .RSpec file. If you look at the .RSpec file, you'll see that it automatically turns on color for you by default. You can essentially put common flags inside of here. There's another one that I like to do, and I'll just go outside of my other editor and do this one. There's a format documentation, so I'm going to go with that one, because that's the one you're probably familiar with if you use the server spec or perhaps even in spec. So I'm going to run RSpec essentially again. And what you're going to see now is color by default without me specifying the flag. And you're also going to see the output in a different format, the documentation format. And documentation format is my favorite, mostly because it uses a little bit more words and actually shows me the content that I'm working on. So look, it tells me here, I love this because it says default recipe, installs the necessary package, includes the install recipe. I feel very confident when I read that versus the periods. Now, most people, after a while, you're like, I don't need the text. I'm cool with periods. That makes a lot of sense to me. But early on, I really like to see the documentation format. Okay, so we got a few more minutes. All right, so we can go into actually some, yeah, nice trim. So we did some refactoring, and we could continue to do some refactoring and shave that yak further and feel confident as we shave that yak that we're doing good work. So I've talked fast enough. Hopefully I haven't lost most of you, because here's the most exciting thing that I want to show you. It's debugging. So I am going to show you a little bit of debugging here and talk about what if we made a typo. So while implementing the node attribute, what if we made a mistake? And this is something that can happen all the time, particularly when you're typing in HTTPD. You might have typed something in like HTPD, right? You might have just quickly fingered that in and just essentially made a mistake. And the problem is when you run the test, what you're going to have is you're going to see it fail, and it's going to continue to fail. And then you're going to look at the source code and you're like, what's wrong? Like, why is the source code failing? Why does it keep breaking? Everything is written correctly. I mean, everything is written correctly. And at that moment, it's a perfect time to go grab your special friend to actually help you troubleshoot. In this case, you might grab, they call it rubber duck debugging. I don't know if you've seen this, rubber duck debugging. So rubber duck debugging, the rubber duck technique for debugging. This is where you're supposed to go talk to a rubber duck. Just have a rubber duck at your desk and start to have it walk through. Because usually what happens is you use your coworker as a rubber duck. Am I right? You bring them over and you start showing them the code, and immediately within 30 seconds of you describing the code, you find the error. And that's why sometimes it's nice to have that rubber duck. I usually just grab the cup of coffee and say, hey, cup of coffee, let me walk you through this code and then tell you what's going on. And then usually I find the issue. But sometimes you're not able to find it still. And these are one of those moments where your mental model of the code is different than the actual model of the code, right? Your mental thought of what is taking place is different than what actually Ruby and Chef is doing. And there are some tools that are going to help you bridge that gap. And this is this tool called Pry. So Ruby has a debugger. And you have access to that debugger because you have the Chef development kit and you have the power of Ruby available to you. So during your test, you can pause the execution as you would if you're familiar with any kind of debugger. So that's what we're going to go through here. We're going to use Pry as a debugger to set up some breakpoints to see some code, to see like pause and sort of interrogate the code and see what's going on. And really, this allows us to ask questions. So you don't even have to do it when you have a typo or problem. You just might be curious to look around at the node object or other things within your code to see that. So I'm going to mutate the code to add the breakpoint to see the issue. So first I'm going to create the issue, and then I'm going to add the breakpoint. So let's return back to my editor. I'm going to come here. I'm going to create the typo that I created for myself, or I talked about creating for myself. And then I'm going to go here to the install recipe, and I'm just going to add the debugger line. So this is the magical incantation you're going to use within your recipes when you start writing it and you want to debug it. So I'm going to say require pry, and then I'm going to say binding.pry. Binding is a special Ruby method that's available on any object. When you say this binding.pry after requiring pry, it's going to set up a breakpoint right here. So this is where it's going to break. So it's going to like move through the execution, get to here, and then pause, and then allow you to interact with it. And I'll show you what that looks like. It's really cool. Okay, so now I'm going to run RSpec again. And I'm not going to run it across all the tests. I'm just going to run it across one of the tests. Here's an example of me just running across one of the tests. So I'm going to look at the install spec, and I'm going to look at the line number. See, this says line number 20 through 22. I can pick any number in between here, 21, and I see it says :21. That's going to say just run the one test, because I just want to run the one test and see this one failure. And so right now, this should run, execute as it would normally would, and it's going to get to my breakpoint, and then it's going to pause. So here we are. It's now paused and allowing me to edit the code. So right here, we've got a little prompt. So I'm kind of pointing at it, hopefully. You got a little prompt here. This little prompt right here is essentially where we can type in code. So I can just type in any Ruby code that I want. Essentially, it's like right there in the recipe, live writing the code. Now, this is something that's really powerful because I can now type in anything I want. I can ask the node object what's going on with it. But before I get into all the sort of details, there's a few commands that you should know about. Number one is probably help. Help shows you all the possible commands. And like I said, I only got about 3 more minutes, so I'm only going to give you a few of the commands here. You should check out pry and figure out the commands that work for you. Help is great. It's going to open up a kind of scrolling window here. You can do a :Q to quit that. And then what you're going to do here is, now what I want to do is where was I? You could do where am I? And where am I is going to show you again the sort of summary of where I'm at. And on this point right here, so I'm right at this moment, I'm going to type in node. And node is going to give me the representation of the node object at this point inside of memory. And you can see right away it's going to give me this attributes right here. So under the node object, that's just kind of a Ruby representation of it. There's an attributes value inside of here. And inside that attributes value, I can see there is all this present. So right there, there's all that content. You know what I'm seeing is I don't see the typo that I created for myself. But that's okay. It's good to experience this anyways without the typo. So I'm going to do :Q again. You can also do node and start to play with the attributes. You could say, hey, does HTTP exist? Does HTTPD exist? Right? You can play with all these different things. And apparently, yep, you notice here that little circle. It's kind of light to see. I didn't actually save the file, but there's a little dot right here, and that means I didn't save the file. So I didn't actually get to see that minor change that I was hoping to see. So I'm going to exit, and I'm going to run this again now that I've saved the file. And I just want to show you how the node object is different. Exciting, right? So in this case, I can put this breakpoint anywhere. So I'm only putting it here at this moment, but you can put it before a node attribute is set, after a node attribute is set, around anywhere. You can put it in the metadata file, right? So I can see this and play with this. The reason why I do that is because sometimes it helps my brain to just kind of like copy this value, right? Like, why isn't this working? Like, and then I see that I go, oh, that's working. But then I, type in, I'm like, how is it using it inside of the recipe? So I go to the install recipe and I say, why isn't this working here, right? And it helps me ask some quick questions and mentally bridge that gap. And that's incredibly important. So I'm all about getting faster feedback to understanding the state of my system, and pry is about as fast as you can get. And there's a lot more to pry. We could talk about that and more. If you're interested in seeing more about that content, please let me know. So let's quickly review this content here. So I created that typo, right? I added that breakpoint. You can put this anywhere you want. I then say now we'll bridge the gap and essentially trigger the breakpoint. I can use chef-exec to essentially run or execute the code. I will see a breakpoint at this moment. I will then get that prompt that I want. That prompt is nice because it allows me to type in help and see other commands that are available. :Q is essentially how to escape out of it. You can use the arrow keys or JK keys that sort of move up and down. And I can see node attributes, and I can look at node attributes of any type and explore different ones and see where I perhaps made a mistake. When I want to exit, I can type in exit or exit bang. Exit bang means exit immediately. Don't continue with the rest of the run. Exit without the bang means finish the rest of the run. And so now, oh, I should go clean up the breakpoint. That's good. That's right. You know, a tidy life is a happy life. So if I were to do this, I want to make sure I check in code without that breakpoint checked in and things like that. So that's always good. And of course, I should go before I leave today, do some cleanup and fix this up. So we're right about time to do some questions. So let's do that. So before we go on to further resources, I want to check my questions. So if you haven't already, there's questions you can submit through the interface here. There are quite a few, so let's see if I can get to a lot of those today. And let's see. I did not see the first webinar. Is it available to watch? So I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I love being able to type out the questions, so let's go with this. So I did not see the webinar. Where's the first one to watch? You can watch them all from the website from chef.io webinars. I believe it's actually being linked, and if it's not linked, it should be present here. But that's really what it is. So where you came today, you'll probably find the test-driven development one right here. And I don't want to do webinar inception right here, but essentially this one right here would be the webinar that you want. And you could, of course, post it to Twitter. And usually what I do is copy the link here. And so you could copy this here. So let me copy that. So that's where to watch it. I encourage you to see it. It goes through a lot of that, those tests and things like that. Okay. Yeah, is this a here's a great question here. So let's answer this question right here. Is the spec recipes unit a common standard? It seems to vary. You know what? It's a this is the standard that we're pushing with the Chef Generator tool. I like it, or I think it's Spec, right? Let's look at the directory again. It's Spec unit recipes is what we have. It is different wherever you go. I'll argue with people at Chef and say like, well, it should be Spec unit recipes. What I like to do, or I prefer, is probably Spec recipes, because I know it's a unit test versus excuse me, an integration test, but spec unit recipes is where we've defined it, and so I'm going to leave it just as that. So it's essentially bike shedding if I'm fighting over a unit directory or not a unit directory. But spec unit recipes is going to be a common standard going forward with the Chef Generator tool, and we of course encourage you to adopt that standard. But whatever standard the community decides on, we'll probably augment ours as time goes on. So if you have a good reason for another one, this is one of those things where request for proposal will be a wonderful thing. Yeah, here's a good question, and I don't know about this. Let me turn on wrapping. Is there any Atom integration for running ChefSpec from a keyboard shortcut or anything like that, just instead of having to avoid from your console and your editor constantly? You know what? I imagine there is. I'm not familiar with running that, because if I am concerned about running stuff automatically, there is another tool that I like to use, and it's kind of further out of the scope of this section, but I would take a look at Guard. So if you're familiar with Ruby, you can do Guard, and Guard is a project that allows you to monitor files constantly, and you can do Guard plus Guard RSpec. So take a look at those, Guard RSpec. And what happens is anytime you make a file change to your spec file or recipe, essentially you could rerun all your tests constantly. So I don't even actually have it, usually I don't even tab away. What I'll do is I'll keep my editor open on one panel, essentially keeping my thing open, and then I'll have my console open on the other, and then I'll essentially be running back and forth, or just I'll be writing code over here, and then this will automatically run over there. So take a look at that project, Guard and Guard RSpec. But I imagine there's probably some sort of integration. As far as Atom is probably borrowing from Sublime, and Sublime is borrowing from TextMate, and sure, there's a command that you could run, a shortcut key that would say essentially run this command and stuff like that. Can you test, let's see through another one here. So again, submitting some questions. There's some great questions coming in. All right. Oh, here's a good one. So this was about Pry. It said, does Pry being a generic tool have any limitations in working with chef recipes? It doesn't. In this case, I mean, it's really, you're just introspecting in Ruby code. So that's kind of a beneficial in the sense of you really have access to all of Ruby. You can do anything you want to do with Ruby, and so there's no limitations whatsoever. I think the only limitation is really like your understanding of Ruby. If you understand Ruby really well, you'll have complete and utter power over that domain, and I think you'll see some really, you'll get to, you know, more power essentially from it. So there's no limitations. It's just a Ruby tool, but essentially that's that. Here's a great question, and something that we don't cover here in this content. I didn't cover here, so no is the quick answer for that. How do you use ChefSpec to test custom resources or LWRPs? We're working on some content to actually show a little bit of that. So we have this test-driven cookbook or test-driven cookbook development course, but we don't go into testing custom resources or LWRPs. Lightweight resource providers is what those are, but custom resources is really where we are now. It's actually in the documentation, and it's not too difficult a transition over. So if I return back to the documentation for GitHub, Seth Bargo, ChefSpec, what I will see is how do I test custom resources? And if you search for custom resources, what you're going to find is for custom resources, you're going to need a little bit more work to get it done. And let me show you a project called Arc, which I have on my local system. So I'll open up source Arc. I think I've got enough time to show this off. Yeah, we got a few minutes here. Love to show this off. So I'll open up Arc, and Arc actually provides, if you look inside of it, the default recipe for Arc. You know, I could read the README. I'm going to cheat a little bit here. It really doesn't do anything, but what it does provide is a custom resource, and actually does it through the LWRP angle. For those that are familiar with the LWRP angle, what it means is, hey, I want to be able to define my own custom resource that acts like any other resource. And you define the actions for it, and then essentially you define the implementation for it. Now, to test this within your spec right here requires just a little bit more work. So in this case, I think I've got that here. To test it, what I do is, oh, I've got some magic going on here. I essentially test it against, well, there's two ways to test it. In the documentation for Seth Orger here is going to say, hey, what you need to do is a thing called step into. So it's called step into. So if you write your own cookbooks with an LWRP, you'll want to be able to test what those custom resources do. In this case, what I mean is if your custom resource says execute this, creates a directory, does something like this, you'll likely want to make sure that you can assert those things, right? That my custom resource executes this, it creates that directory, and it pulls down this file or manipulates this file. And you'll need to use this step into. So really when you set up your runner, all you do is you provide a new value. So in this case, if, say, we created something in our HTTPD cookbook, in this one right here, if I were to, say, need to test that, all I would be doing is something like this. Hey, add this right here. Step into the HTTPD, my LWRP. So it might be something like install, right? You know, something like that. In the future, we might do something like that. And that's all you have to add if you define your own custom resource. And there's a lot more to this conversation, but hopefully that'll give you sort of a hint at it. I also do something special in the Arc cookbook, which is, within the Arc cookbook, I actually create within the spec directory a cookbook that consumes the cookbook. So you'll see along the left side here, it's kind of small to see, but there's actually a cookbook inside of my cookbook because yo dog, I love cookbooks. So I build a cookbook inside of here that actually uses my cookbook as a custom resource, and I'm able to verify it that way. So that's the way I felt comfortable sort of testing it and seeing it work out. That was a great question. That's one thing, that content we don't cover, but one of those things that I would love to cover in the time frame. So if you're interested in that as well, send me a comment. I'd love to help you out or sort of answer those questions. Now, where did I put my questions at? I might have closed that tab here. I may have, but that's okay. What you can do is just make another one. Here's another question. Do you always have to define a ChefSpec chef runner in your recipes? Yes, for the test you do, you always have to set up that runner. That runner is going to fake that in-memory resource collection, so definitely you're going to need that. What was the spec parameter to switch to documentation mode? Yeah, that was a good one. What was the spec parameter to switch to documentation mode? So let's switch back over to the command line here. I'm in the directory, so RSpec-help is going to give us a lot of the possible commands and flags we're going to need. You can see that there's some format options here. That's what I'm really going for. -F or -- format. There's progress, which is by default. The thing in the square brackets right here means that's the letter you can use. So you don't have to write out the entire name. You could just say D instead of documentation, or P for progress, or HTML or JSON. So the flag that I was using for that was RSpec-FD, or you could write it out, right? You could do documentation if you want to write that out. And of course, remember I used that RSpec-init, and what that did was generate that .RSpec file. And in that .RSpec file, that's where I had essentially my flags. Oops, my head's in the way. Let me move it. The color required and then the format D. So you could do that. You could add that to there. So, this was a good question. Jasper here is asking. Thanks, Jasper. This is the last question, then we'll run into some resources here. What DSL does ChefSpec use, ServerSpec or InSpec? Can you use both? What DSL does ChefSpec use? So the most important thing to remember is that RSpec is the core. So there's Ruby. Its base is Ruby, then RSpec, and then I'll get that slide up, and then we'll kind of finish on that one. So that's a good reminder. So let me go to the slide that talks about RSpec and ChefSpec. So really this important thing is, like, I show this as a parallel here because Ruby is really the core of everything. So Chef is built on top of Ruby and has its own domain-specific language. RSpec is a domain-specific language on top of it. ChefSpec just takes what RSpec gives us, the expectations, the examples, the context, the helpers, all that wonderful stuff, and then provides all that sort of resource collection stuff along with it. So it allows us to have that. So really the core domain-specific language is RSpec. So, and really if I were to draw all these pictures out, ServerSpec is right here, right? ServerSpec, you know, if I draw it out too, it's InSpec. InSpec is also on top of RSpec. So all of RSpec really extends out and covers a lot. So that's the core DSL to everything. And that's why I encourage you to learn more about RSpec, because in that you're going to gain a lot of insights in terms of how to use or how to build your test suite better. All right. Well, I appreciate your time. Before you go, let me show you a few more resources to get you kind of on your way, to help you, for the future and that kind of thing. I don't want to leave you hanging, kind of give you some stuff, particularly where this content is, you know, where some more content will be for you. I love when I go to the orange slide. I look like a Oompa Loompa. All right. So again, I encourage you to email me. So if there's any questions that came up during this presentation, email me. I don't get enough email now that we have Slack, and quite a few people emailed me last time. Hopefully I got that back to most of you. I may have missed some emails. I actually got quite a bit more than I imagined. But I do love them, and I do love having those conversations. And some of you actually really helped me by emailing me. As someone who generates content, I love to hear about what you're working on, what you're building, and it really makes our content and our training much better. So I appreciate that. So please reach out to me. You're also welcome to just rate this. So pop in there. It helps me do my job. So any comments that you would like to give, any rating that you'd like to give, I'd love to hear back from you. It helps me do my job better and understand how I can better serve you. And of course, you're welcome to leave comments about future content that you would like to see, future ideas, things that you're struggling with, things that you would love for us to cover in webinars. Okay. Now here's some resources that I'd love to give to you. So I recently started a show called The Joy of Automating. It's every Friday on our YouTube channel. So it's Friday live. So similar to this webinar, if this thing works for you, we do a little more casual sort of get together. I'm not moving through as many slides. I'm really just building something live. And the idea is to work together to build some content and really just stress and build our skills. So it's very similar to programmers doing these katas, right? The focus is really not on the journey, not on the destination, like what we're building, you know, and solving a problem. It's more just the journey of building something and learning in the process of building, raising questions, thinking about the work that we do. Something that we don't often get to do when we do our work in every day, because oftentimes there's a deadline involved. And so the only deadline that we have is we've got to be done in an hour. But of course, you're welcome to work with me and then, of course, spend time afterwards. We had a good group last time that met up. Like I said, I sort of lead the group. I go through my example, and you're sort of able to automate along with me. And then, of course, people are there to answer questions and hang out with you and sort of work along with you. And, of course, you can just watch along as well. So it's Fridays, 10 a.m., so same time as here, just 2 more days in the future. Just go to subscribe to our YouTube channel or look for that, and we'll get in contact with you if you subscribe, and notifications should go out about that. I'd love to see you there. Now, if you're interested in a full course, a full 8-hour day of this content, the test-driven development content, go to our training page. There's a coupon here that you can sign up for, take 15% off, and then get into that course. Let me go back there. So TDD Web. So go here to the training. Yeah, 15% off the course. You'll spend a whole day with me. I'll run through the content with you. You'll see a lot of the very similar things we did here, but with exercises for you to do to reinforce that. And of course, if you have personal questions you asked here that I didn't get to, I'll be able to answer more of those while we have time during those 8 hours. All the slides and the content are available here. So while the course is online, or while the course I might deliver to you, you can pay for it. If you're interested in the content and you want to see it, you can come to the Test-Driven Development Cookbook course and go there, download the slides, even this webinar. So this webinar that I created is inside of that directory. I think it's minus a few yaks, but I'll put the yak full version inside of there. And all these things are actually in the attachment. So you don't quickly feel like you have to write all these things down. Just take a look at the attachment section, click on some of those, and you'll get the links you need. There are some things that are probably actually not in the attachments, and these are for those that are, of course, following along or watching. There's a few more webinars on the page that I encourage you to watch. There's a TDD one, which I mentioned. There's a static analysis one that I did, which is a great accompaniment to this. There's a test kitchen one, which Fletcher Nichols goes into and explains test kitchen in more detail. And of course, our YouTube channel, there's a bunch of videos going up on there. And of course, the joy of automating that's happening there. Here's, of course, the obligatory links to all the documentation, RSpec, ChefSpec, InSpec, and ServerSpec. Documentation, of course, is sometimes difficult to read. You'll find the most joy in reading the ChefSpec documentation. The README is great, and the example folder is great. I encourage you to use that. But remember, write those pending tests, and then, of course, fill in the details as you come along. And my terminal, people always ask, and I'm always happy to tell you about. I've changed the colors here to make it a little brighter for everybody. But I'm on a Mac. I'm using iTerm 2, soon to be iTerm 3, Oh My ZSH, and the Agnoster theme is what you're hoping for. And this is the Powerline patch font, so that's great, and all that. So everything's under the attachments. Go there, click there, and of course I'm getting pulled off stage here. We're running out of time. I've definitely been over about 2 minutes. So I encourage you again, and I ended with a similar comment. I really love this tweet when I was talking about it, was that test-driven development seems hard, and particularly when you start moving from, say, even just ServerSpec to InSpec to ChefSpec. What test do I write? How do I get better at what I'm doing? The most important thing is, remember, it's just all practice. And these tests are there to help you have a conversation with yourself. So it really, if your coworkers are going to look at you strange, we're talking to a rubber duck, they're probably not going to look at you strange if you're talking to your test suite. Maybe they will still, but the idea here is that the test suite, and I've found in my life, is that the test suite allowed me to have a conversation, for me to think out loud what my expectations are, and allow me to be a better coder. And in the same way, debugging with Pry allowed me a lot of great chances to really understand and bridge that gap, that mental model that I had and the actual model of things. And bridging that gap was a huge, important step to becoming a great software developer. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you in the future, and I hope to hear from you. Goodbye.